Judy, can you conduct the roll call?
Yes, Ms. Shatmeyer?
Here.
Ms. Forrester?
Here.
Ms. Cavanis is absent by prior arrangement. Mr. Jurdy?
Here.
Ms. Smith?
Here.
Thanks. Mr. Cromer?
Here.
And Mr. Shoemaker will be with us momentarily. Ms. Harris? Absent. And Mr. Anderson?
Here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's conduct the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
For which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hey, Judy, do we have any members of the public who wish to comment on items not on today's agenda?
We do not have any public comment at this time.
Okay, thank you. Next thing on our agenda is we have actually a consent calendar. Well, anyway, so we'll take separate action. We have discussion possible action regarding resolution 2021-07, authorizing teleconference meetings pursuant to government code. Do we have a motion to approve our teleconference meeting?
So moved, Chair.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? Okay, not seeing it. Can we have roll call?
Ms. Shatmeyer?
Yes.
Ms. Forrester?
Yes.
Mr. Jurdy?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Mr. Shoemaker?
Aye.
And Mr. Anderson? Sorry. Approved.
Thanks. So that takes us to discussion of the historical benefit review project status report.
Thank you, Chair Jurdy and members of the board. Due to the timings since last month's meeting was so short, we do not have an update on this at this time. We'll have the November update at the December meeting, or the October update along with the November update at the December meeting.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any comments on this agenda item?
I see no comments at this time.
Thanks. So that takes us to discussion possible action of the June 30th, 2021 Actuarial Valuation Study.
Thank you, Chair Jurdy. There's a cover memo in your package regarding the valuation. We do have representatives from Siegel here to discuss it. This is an action item to adopt the report and adopt the recommendation of the contribution rates for the county. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andy Young with Siegel.
Thank you, Doris. Good morning, Chair Jurdy and other members of the board. My name is Andy Young with Siegel. I'm joined by my partner, Dirk Adamson. We have two actuarial work products to be presented to the board today. The first, as Doris has indicated, is the June 30, 2021 valuation. So with that, I will ask to actually share my screen because I have the valuation report loaded up. So I just want to everybody to be able to take a look at that with me. So can you see my valuation report?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As has been the case in the past, when we do the valuation, we prepare the and compare the funding status of the plan. And if the board approves our recommended contribution rate based on the results from the June 30, 2021 valuations, these contribution rates for the employer and employee will become effective for the 22-23 fiscal year. So in other words, there's always been a 1-year schedule delay to get the valuation done, to get the contribution rates approved, and to get the contribution rates implemented in the county and the other employers' payroll system. So there's always a 1-year gap. Now, in preparing this valuation, we have followed the actuarial funding policy that has been approved by the board, and it was last reviewed just about a year or so ago. In this valuation report, there's actually one item which is new, brand new, even though this was as a result of the additional study that we have been asked by the board to produce as following the conclusion of the June 30, 2021 valuation. So the question was asked, assuming that we have another good year, and we do, what could happen if the board were to so choose to accelerate the funding of the plan so as to pay off the unfunded liability a little bit faster than it would be otherwise happen following again the funding policy that the board has reviewed several years ago. So that's included as part of the tail end of the presentation, and there are 4 scenarios that the board has asked SIGO to include. So we'll take a look at those and explain why any one of those scenarios may be of interest to the board, and how do those 4 scenarios compare to the current contribution rate that we are recommending as part of the routine execution of the funding policy. Now, as is always the case, if there are any questions that any board members would want us to address during the presentation, please feel free to stop me during the presentation. So with that in mind, I'm going to launch into the valuation report. I'm going to look at a couple of bullet point items with the board today. The first really has to do with comparing the amount of assets in the plan with the liability. So it can be done in one of 2 ways. We can take the assets divided by the liability, and we call that the funding ratio of the plan. We can also take the difference between the amount of liability and the assets, and we call that the unfunded liability of the plan. So it's really a question as to if there were to be a shortfall, and we do have a shortfall of assets compared to the liability, how much of a shortfall we have expressed as a percent as well as in terms of the absolute dollar amount. Now, for this year's valuation, actually we make good progress because the funding ratio, which again compares the assets to the liability, has gone up from 69% in the last valuation to about 73% in this year's valuation. And the reason why you might have heard from the folks at Callan that we have done very well on an investment basis. The rate of return, at least according to our calculation, was well in excess of 30%. So how come the funding ratio has only marginally improved by only like four basis points when compared to last year? And this really as a result of the fact that in a good year, such as what happened in year 2020-21, we did not take all the market gains and recognize that in 1 year. The board has a asset smoothing method. So in good times, you would rather, than under your policy, recognize only 20% of those good news. And likewise, if we were to have a bad year, which we did not, of course, in 2020-21, we would only have recognized 20% of the bad news. So it's very symmetrical with the end outcome that in a good year, we are banking a very significant portion of those gains, so that 80% of those gains. So that is why if instead of using the smooth value of assets, which we call in the funding valuation to set the contribution rate, but rather if we were to move to a market value basis, the funding status actually improved quite tremendously, because in the same valuation last year, when Dirk and I presented the report to you last year, the funding status, if measured on a market value basis, would have been actually a little bit lower than the funding status on a smooth value basis, because it was only about 67.68% last year. However, this year, if we were to use market value, the funding status would actually have improved all the way to 85%. So I know that we are always wanting the fund to become 100% funded, but at least in one short year, with a huge swing and upswing in the market, you can actually see that the funding status actually improved quite a bit, from 67.8 to 84.9, call it 85%. So if we were to use market value, we would have seen a very tremendous increase in the funding status. Now, among other reasons why we don't use market value, of course, is that in a good year, such as what happened this year, the contribution rate for the employer would be expected to go way down, and we will show you what the rate reduction would be. But on the flip side, if we were to have a bad year, the contribution rate for the employer would have go way up. And so in order to make sure that the employers would have enough time to either absorb a contribution loss or to plan for a contribution gain, the board has chosen to use a 5-year asset smoothing method, which allows the employer in good or bad times to basically plan for contribution rate reduction, which is what we're going to be presenting to you today, or contribution rate increase. So with that, I'll just pause to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Mr. Young, we have a question for Vice Chair Smith.
Hi, Andy. Mine was just a question about the terminology when I was reading this yesterday. You explained it all wonderfully well, thank you. But the term valuation value of assets was confusing to me. But when you say valuation value, is that always going to mean that we're including the 5-year smoothing?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And
It's not an accounting term I'm familiar with. So valuation value, is it?
exactly. It's really an actuarial term. And there's a page in the report which we will look into. But really, the only difference between the smooth value of assets, which we call the actuarial value in this report, and the asset space that we use in the valuation, which we call the valuation value, again, strictly actuarial term, is the contingency reserve. There's really a reserve set aside, a rainy day fund, which we put aside that we don't use for the valuation. And again, another cushion that is built into the accounting according to the 37 Act. But loosely speaking, the valuation value is the smooth value, very close to the actuarial value.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so because there are no other questions, let me just, because we talk about this so-called funding status, so let me also try to compare the amount of liability we have in plan and the assets we have in plan. That's the unfunded actuarial deferred liability, which is provided on the second item on page 7 of the report. The amount of the unfunded liability when we present the report to you like last year was $244 million. So this year, that amount has gone down to $221 million. Now, there's actually a couple of reasons why there's that reduction. So rather than to read those to you, I'm now going to go to page 30 of my funding valuation report, because there's a nice table which summarizes how the unfunded liability has changed between the 2020 valuation and the 2021 valuation. So on the top of the tables, item number 1, the amount of the unfunded liability, I'm going to refer to that from now on as the UAAL, was $244 million. Now, if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met, the amount of the unfunded liability, even after our employer, the county, the cemetery district, and the court, and the members, of course, pay all the contributions, the UAAL actually would only have been expected to reduce down to $240 million. So at that point, the board members may stop me and say, well, how come, in spite of the employer following our recommendation to pay us the UAAL contribution, there's only such a small reduction in UAAL if all the actuarial assumptions were to be met between the 2000 and 2001 valuation. Now, that's really has to do with the fact that right now there's a layer, an amount of unfunded liability works almost like a mortgage. So rather than to ask the employer to cut us a check, which of course we would not do, but if instead of asking the employer to pay off his mortgage over a number of years, if we were to ask the employer to cut us a check of $244 million, then we would get rid of the total amount of the unfunded liability. But because we don't do that, and because the unfunded liability is amortized in layers, and the longest layer, the longest mortgage that we have set up for the county and the other 2 employers was over a 18-year amortization schedule. Actually, last year was 19 years. So that is the reason why, even if the employer and the employer has, of course, paid down the mortgage as what we expect them to, in spite of the employer paying that mortgage, that UAL has only gone down marginally by $4 million. And again, that's, I think, another reason why I know that the board was interested last year to ask Segal for the study of alternatives that may be implemented in order for the UAL to be paid off faster, sooner rather than later. So we will talk about that when we go to the appendix section of the report. But until that happens, what we would expect to see happen is a gradual reduction in the UAL. However, this year, we do have a few items which contribute to a reduction greater than what we would have expected. The biggest item that I have already talked about is the fact that even after we go through the 5-year asset smoothing method, even after we don't recognize all the investment gains from 2021. We only recognize 20% of those gains. We still have a very good year on a smooth actuarial value or valuation value of assets basis, because that valuation assets actually earn a rate of return a little bit over 10%. So we'll go and see a page in the report which talks about the 10%. But until then, just pencil in this number for me, if you will, which is the 19%, $19 million reduction in the unfunded liability because of the assets earning more than the assumed rate of 6.75% that we have assumed in the valuation. So we know that the employer, the county, has gone through a multi-year collective bargaining process. I think maybe 2 years ago, you already alert Segal that it is more than likely that we will see some actuarial losses because of salary increases that were finally given to our members after a few drought years. So that is the reason why this year we continue to see some salary increases which are greater than expected by the actuarial assumptions, about $9 million. On the other hand, our retirees do not get the 3%, up to maximum 3% COLA, which would be allowed by the county according to the provisions that they have adopted. So we save about $5 million. There's always this 1 year delay between the contribution rate calculation and rate implementation that I talked about earlier on. And there are some slightly higher than expected mortality experience from our retirees. And there's always this other actuarial experience gains and losses. Some of that is really contributed by the fact that the board is implementing the decision that was passed down by the Supreme Court in year 2020, we otherwise known as the Alameda decision. So if we add up all these items, then you can see that the net change or the net reduction in the unfunded liability is about $18 million. Now, coincidentally, this call it $19 million is actually very close to the investment gains that we have. So that means that all the other actuarial experience outside of investment, they kind of cancel each other. So we actually are enjoying the benefit of having a rate of return of 30%. Even after assets moving, we have a rate of return which is over 10%. And that is really the one main, if I'm only allowed to talk about one main reason why the unfunded liability is going down, is really because of the investment experience, even after going through the 5 years moving process. So the unfunded liability net is going down in total from $244 million to $221 million. A very good reduction of over 10%.
Thank you. Dr. Cromer.
Thank you, Chair Jurdy. Andy, my question, I think we have brought this up during your previous valuation reports to us about the individual salary increases that were expected and anticipated and known to the county because of what they considered salary adjustments that were extremely higher than they have been in years past and higher than the expectations by the valuation reports. So I know that most of those bargaining units are in their last year of that contract, and of course we'll be negotiating for future contracts here next fiscal year. I also understand that your reports are a year behind in the sense that we base the next year's settings on last year's performance. Is there any way to implement that into the expectations of the plan to know the amount of raises that our members are going to be getting, especially if it's much higher than expected on the actuarial report? Or is it just something we have to do a year later to understand the true effect of those raises?
I think for the time being, it will be taken into account a little bit after the fact. I said that because the next time when we would be looking at the actuarial assumptions, we call that the experience study, would be done before the 2023 valuations. However, at that time, we would then have the experience from 2000, 2001, 2002, and we would take all the higher salary increases into account. And then we would be including those in the recommended assumptions for using the 2023 evaluation. So until then, and unless the board asks Segal to perform an out-of-cycle review, we would continue to take the back of the mirror approach, the retrospective approach in recognizing those increases. I know that Quincy, you haven't asked a question, but if you would ask Segal, are we comfortable, right, in in trailing behind. I would say, in light of the experience that we have, I think I would be comfortable only because we have been sitting on, and we will continue to sit on for the next several years investment gains that we have not yet recognized in the valuation process. So what I would expect to see happen is that even if we were to see another year of salary increase greater than expected, hopefully, fingers crossed, most of that increases, if not all of the increases, would be mitigated by investment gains that are not yet recognized in the valuation. So I know a very long answer to your question, so it would be looked at retrospectively until the next experience study, but I'm still comfortable with taking that approach, even though we are trailing behind.
Okay, I think I understand that. And at the end of the day, I know that it looks on here like it's an adjustment, but in my mind, it's something that I believe all the board members expected. We didn't know the true impact that it could have because these were, for some bargaining units, it was over 30% over 3 years. And we were all anticipating a rather large hit because we didn't know what the ultimate estimate would be, but I think we could calculate that in the future. But I do understand and appreciate your answer.
Dr. Shoemaker.
Thank you. Andy, on the unfunded liability, there's a note within your report here that the courts and the cemetery district did not contribute their share, I'll call it, to the unfunded liability accounts. So my question is this calculation an aggregate of the county, the cemetery district, and the courts? Or are those all calculated individually for unfunded liability purposes?
It's actually calculated in total for the 3 employers combined. I'm glad that Richard, you bring this up because in the funding valuation report, we did mention, I think it's on page 8, that the court is a little bit behind. They're falling behind by about $16,000. And the cemetery district is falling behind by about $6,000. I know that the cemetery district has already made up for the contributions as we speak, because they put in the contribution, I think it was around October 13th of 2021. So for the court, for the $16,000, we understand that they have been notified that they need to pay up, and they have done so by increasing the contributions that presumably they have been paying since 7/1 of 2021. So I think I kind of misspoke a little bit when I say all employers have paid their share or the expected amount of the unfunded liability. So I think technically I should have said that the county has done that for the 2 other employers. Cemetery district have done so, but if we take into account the contribution that they made after June 30 of 2021, because that $5,000 that they still owe the association, but the court definitely have taken action to do that. But technically, as the date of this presentation, they haven't done so.
Okay, so I'm going to clarify. Just thank you. That's a good explanation. So this valuation we're seeing has it assumes they will pay up by the end of the fiscal year. Is that correct? Thank you.
Doris, you had your hand raised? Did you want to clarify or add additional?
I just wanted to mention, in addition to the district having made that payment by October, I believe the court has or is on target to pay off that $16,000 that they were short of June 30 within the next pay period, if it hasn't happened already. Robert had mentioned that the other day, so it's well underway.
Thanks. Director Anderson?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is for Andy or for Doris, but I know, Andy, in the report on a similar vein, you mentioned that the cost of living adjustment account within the reserves was close to having no unfunded liability. And I know that there was an accounting change sometime in the past where the allocation of funds amongst the reserves was corrected. Too much was going into the COLA account and not enough was going into just the county's general reserve. And I'm wondering if some action needs to be taken on that, whether it's kind of self-correcting at this point, and whether or not that affects contribution rates.
Jim, I can address part of that, and then I'll leave the part regarding the contribution rate for Andy. But we are researching that to identify the trend and what was underlying it, which I believe has been done after my discussions with Robert. And we will be working with Siegel to address that divergence between the general regular reserve and the COLA reserve. As far as the effect on contribution rates, I'll leave that to Andy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doris. Yeah, I think the short answer is even though it would impact the breakdown of the total contribution rate between what is referred to as the basic benefit without the COLA and the COLA component of the benefit, but there's no impact on the total rate, so which is very important. We like to get, of course, the breakdown correct between basic and COLA, but other than that, even though when we get the money from the employer's account and from the members, we like to put it in the right buckets. So even after we shuffle some of the assets around, as Doris has indicated, it would not be expected to change the total rate that we are recommending to the board today.
Thanks, Andy and Doris.
So not seeing any questions, I'm going to actually advance to the page where we would see the change in the employer's rate, because while we are at it, so we can certainly go in and take a look at see how the contribution rate, and this, by the way, is the aggregate rate that we are recommending to the board. It's made up of the contribution rate that built up from, for example, for the general membership category, the safety and the probation membership categories. And among those three membership categories, then there are rates that are recommended for each and every plan. So each and every tier. So as we always like to say, there's really no employer in plan that we are expecting to or requesting to pay the 34% of payroll that we are recommending to the board. So this is just a shorthand way to explain how the rate changes from one year to the next. So in the last valuation, if we aggregate using today's payroll, the contribution rate for all the three membership categories and among all the different tiers, that rate would have been 37.44% of payroll, or roughly $30 million. So for the reasons that we've talked about on the change in unfunded liability, most of those items are actually represented on this rate page. So for example, when I say there was a 1 year delay in implementing the contribution rate, so that's the impact on this page. When I talk about the fact that the plan after asset smoothing has earned 10% plus rate of return, there's a reduction in the unfunded liability. There's also a change in the employer's contribution rate. So similarly, the impact of a higher than expected UAL, that's also has an impact on the rate that you see here. So likewise, the COLA, there's one, and then there's the higher than expected, slightly higher than expected mortality among our retirees, and also the other actuarial experience. So that actually only leaves us with two items that you haven't heard me talk about when I was going through the reconciliation of the unfunded liability with you. And that really has to do with the effect of the change in the membership demographics. Now, in the valuation report, we talk about actually two causes, two category of cause. We've talked at length about the change in the unfunded liability and how that could translate into UAL rate. There's also a normal cost, so to speak, that is paid for by both the employer and the employee. And loosely speaking, it is the amount of cost that we expect the employer and the employee to pay for that 1 additional years of service that they expected to accrue for the 2022-23 fiscal year. So it's always normal to expect some slight shifting in the demographics. For example, how many of our members are at a certain particular entry age when they enter the retirement association? How many of those members may be male or female? That all of those factors could contribute to a change, a small change in the rate. And for this year, it is actually a small favorable and a reduction in that rate of about 0.16% of payroll. Now, the other item that we have talked about, which is associated with salary increases, higher than expected, and we have already talked about the increase in the unfunded liability, and that's how much of that is going to translate into an increase in the contribution rate, into a UAL, and therefore a contribution rate change. However, because the unfunded liability in the plan is amortized as a percentage of payroll, we take the dollar contributions in order to pay off that UAL and actually spread that as a percentage of the payroll. One thing that actually happened, especially when the payrolls are growing faster as a result of higher salary increases granted by the county to its employees, is that now we have a bigger payroll base to amortize those unfunded liability dollar contribution amount. As a matter of fact, in the 2020 valuation, we actually only have an expectation that payroll will grow at an assumed rate of 3.25%. So that's made up of 2.75% inflation plus another 50 basis points for wage increases. However, in the front of the report, which I will not go into, even though we have about the same number of active members as we have in the last valuation, but the payroll base actually have gone up by about 7.4%. So it is well over 2 times as big as what we expect the payroll base to grow up by. So in other words, if we were to look at the impact of higher than expected salary increase in the aggregate, it actually comes into 2 parts. There's a higher UAL. There's also a high payroll base for us to amortize that UAL. So one could argue that if you were to look at the 2 impacts together and see and use those combined impact to answer the question, what is really the impact on the employer's contribution rate, is actually favorable, because even though the contribution rate would have gone up by about 90 basis points because of high salary increases granted to individual employees, but because we have a bigger payroll base to amortize the UAL, so you can argue that the net impact on the rate, there's no question that this increased the unfunded liability of the plan, but at least the impact on the rate is actually slightly favorable, because now the rate actually slightly goes down. But I'm not saying this because the county is not expected to pay more UAL contributions. So I'm just saying this because the rate is expected to go slightly lower because the payroll base is bigger than what we have expected. So I know that this can be confusing. So let me pause to see if there are any questions before I continue. Okay. So not hearing any. So now I'm going to take a quick peek at the change in the employee rates. Again, there's no employee in the plan for whom we are expecting that employee to pay a rate of 10.02% of pay. So this is really, again, another shorthand way to explain the change in the contribution rate from one valuation to the next. So long and short is, until we do our experience study, which would not be expected until year 2023, we really do not expect to see very dramatic change in the employees' contribution rate. And as a matter of fact, for this year's valuation, they are almost the same as what we have recommended to the board last year. It has gone slightly down in a total by about $12,000. So really just a very status quo recommendation as far as the employees' contribution rate is concerned. Now, I know that the board has asked me this question in the past. So the question could be, well, how come the employer is getting the benefit of the investment gains, right? So we said more or less that the contribution rate is going down by almost 3.3% of payroll. Most of that is coming in from investment gains, but yet the employees' rate is really not changing in spite of that very good investment for 2020-21. And that really has to do with the fact that under the 1937 Act, whenever there's in this case, a favorable actuarial experience because of investment experience coming in better than expected, we don't share that gain with the employees. However, in bad years, and there were quite a few of those in the years past, we don't share those best experience with the employees either. So the employees' rate are set based on a set of actuarial assumptions. They were not asked to pay either less contributions or more contributions in good times or in bad. So now with that contribution rate recommendation, so I'm going to actually go to 2 other places in the report before I go to the appendix section of the report. So the one place that I like to take a look at with the board together today is really just go through the assets smoothing page that I've been alluding to. So the way this works is provided on a lot of detail on page 21 of the valuation report. So what happened is in year 2021, for the year ended June 30, 2021, the actual rate of return, like I said, was about 30% of about 30%, even though we only expect the fund to earn 6.25%. So what happened in dollars terms is that the actual return for that year was $166 million. We only expect the fund to earn 36 million. So relative to that expectation, we have out-earned the assumption by about $130 million. And the way asset smoothing works is rather than to recognize all these gains in 1 year, we only recognize 20% of that. And the 20% came about, of course, is because I take 1 divided by 5. So we actually recognize 20% for each of the next 4 years, including the 20% that we have recognized for this year. So that's why we're deferring for recognition purposes 80% of that gains for the next 4 years. So, however, I want to remind the board that the market could be very volatile. Just as recent as year 2020, we expect the fund again to earn about 36 million, but the actual return was much lower than that. It was only $14 million. So likewise, when we have a good year and in bad times, we only recognize 20% of that in 1 year. So that's the reason why even on the books today, we have only recognized 40% of those losses, deferring 60% of those losses for the next 3 years. However, if you look at the combined amount, we're now looking at a combined investment gain that we have not yet recognized of $91 million. So what happened is for the valuation, we talked about the smooth value assets. We talk about the actuarial value, which is $605 million. It's set such that it is $91 million less than the market value because we're deferring a significant portion of the investment gain, especially the ones from 2021. And after we subtract the contingency reserve, in this valuation, we have only used about $600 million. So then you could ask what happened to the remaining $91 million? When would those investment gains be recognized? That we have a schedule at the bottom of the page. $21 million will be recognized in year 2022 valuation in 21 and so on. So that's the reason why when Quincy asked me the question just now, so in spite of the fact that we are behind in recognizing those salary losses, would we continue to be comfortable? And at least based on the information we have available at the time of the valuation, we know that we have possibly another $21 million of actuarial gains, investment gains that we have not recognized and that will be bringing as part of the actuarial pipeline. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to one more page in the report because folks would be interested to find out, but if we were to use those market gains to set the contribution rate, how much the contribution rate would become in the next several years. So even though in this valuation report, we haven't given you the contribution rate reduction when the $21 million from next year and the $21 million or so for the next several years were to come into play, but at least we have a shorthand way to give you an idea of those contribution rate impact. Because in this valuation, I'm now going back to page 9 of the report, the contribution rate that we are recommending for the plan as a whole is about 34% payroll. If we were to recognize those 90 million plus investment gains right away, which of course we would not recommend, the contribution rate in this report actually would go down by almost 10% of payroll. So unless we were to have investment losses for the next 4 years, and unless when we do the next triennial experience study getting geared up for the June 30, 2023 valuation, we were to come to recommend to the board more conservative actuarial assumptions. So everything else being equal, you can expect to see the contribution rate for the next 4 years coming down by about 10% of payroll for the next several years. So the good news does not stop with this valuation. So again, fingers crossed, if all the assumptions were to be met, we would actually expect the contribution rate to continue to drop maybe by about another 2.25% of payroll each year for the next 4 years. Okay. So then I think at that point, I can actually show you one last page in the report before we go to the amortization schedule. I'm sorry, the few scenarios that the board has asked us to take a look at. I know that it's always difficult for the board to feel terribly comfortable because of the fact that even though we have continued to make good progress, we're still sitting on about $221 million of unfunded liability. And as a matter of fact, if you were to ask Siegel, how long would it take? Forget about the investment gains that we're sitting on that we have not yet recognized. But if we were to just have so years, we just earned the assumed rate of 6.75%, even after going through the assets moving method, how long would it take before the entire association would become fully funded? And now, in this case, for a good plan, it would actually take another 18 years. And the reason why this is the case is because if you look at the amortization schedule, this actually takes the amount of the unfunded liability of $221 million today, and it actually shows you how that progressed over time. And you can see that it would take actually 18 years before the UAL will be drawn down to zero, assuming that we don't have any favorable or unfavorable actuarial experience. And the primary reason why this is the case is because back about 10 plus years ago, the board has decided to re-amortize the unfunded liability at the time. So the amount of unfunded liability that was re-amortized was over a 27-year period. So with the end outcome that in this valuation, we still have 18 years left in the amortization schedule. So if I were to count these bars, red bars, which represent the restart layers, it would take another 18 years before all the red bars will be taken care of. Now, even though, well, of course, after all the other actuarial experience gains and losses are taken into account, the red bar becomes less and less, relatively speaking anyway, significant over time. But nonetheless, if the goal is to get to become 100% funded sooner rather than later, it would take a good 18 years until 2039 before the entire amount of the unfunded liability would be paid for. Now, I know that you may not be comfortable with settling with that long a period of time before the UAL is paid off, but I want to at least tell the board that as the unfunded liability for the next several years to pay off, not the amount of UAL contributions that we expect the employees will pay, even though we will be expected to continue to escalate over the next several years at the assumed rate of 3.25%. But in about year 2031, that's when some of the UAL would be paid off and the UAL contributions amounts would be decreased. But if you want to know in absolute dollar terms, when would the UAL contributions become zero? The answer is still about the same. It's still not until year 2039, only because we still have to amortize the, relatively speaking, longer restart layer, because as of the day of this valuation, we still have 18 years left in that amortization schedule. So that, I think, is the reason why, if I have to guess, the board may be interested in looking at scenarios, especially in light of the contribution rate reduction of over 3%, 3 1/3% of payroll of about $2.7 million, why the board might be interested in looking at strategies to help the employer pay off his UAL sooner rather than later. So I don't know if you have any questions, but I certainly would pause to see if there are any questions before I launch into the last section of the report.
Dr. Shoemaker?
I think, Richard, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Is that better? Okay, if we did not reduce the employer contribution rate from 37, can you give a calculation on what the reduction in years to pay off would be? That's about 1.2% of the.
That's right. Yeah, I don't. So Dirk can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have tried to answer that question. I think the part which might be dependent on what actions the board may take later on down the road would be: are you going to continue to, let's say, for lack of a better word, impose the higher rate in spite of contribution rate reduction, which may follow? I think that would be the question that we need to ask. But you're quite right that now maybe with that question that I asked, I can actually now go into, because that's actually one of the, as the board is aware, that's one of the scenarios that you have asked us to take a look at. So why don't I just focus on that? This is the fourth scenario, the one that we've added after we present the rates for the June 30, 2020 evaluation. As Richard has indicated, if the board were to so choose to retain the same contribution rate that the board approved 1 year ago, for the upcoming 2022-23 fiscal year, the contribution rate, at least relative to the recommendation in this valuation, would have gone up by 3.33% of payroll. In dollars terms, it's about $2.6 million, even though the contribution rate that the employers would have paid for the current fiscal year would be actually carried unchanged. So the question is, with this $2.6 million, which is about a little bit over 1% of the size of the unfunded liability, right? We have about $221 million. How long, how much shorter would we be able to pay off the unfunded liability? I think maybe if you can, I think you can answer that question, because I know that in under scenario 3, we do have this question that came up from the board from early on, dealing with a one-time $4 million payment. So I don't know if we have enough information. So maybe let me turn around. If the board is interested in adopting this scenario, we can certainly go back, come back to the board later on and tell you if this is going to be something that you want to do, not just for 1 year, but for the foreseeable future, how much shorter you will be able to pay off the UAL. So maybe this is something that we cannot answer on the fly, but we certainly can do that, bring that answer back to the board if this is something of interest.
Yeah, I would suggest it's a point of discussion, and definitely a discussion with the plan sponsors. That I'm not so sure we would just do it.
We do have an estimate of that number, Andy, if you want me to give that.
Yeah, please do.
It's about 4 years earlier.
Well,
Director
Thank you.
Anderson?
Yeah. Andy, I know that you mentioned on the UAL amortization schedule that you just use the existing assumptions. Did you by any chance, although it's not presented here, look at if there were no actuarial losses against those deferred gains, what that UAL amortization period would look like?
Tim, are you talking about the graph that I showed?
Yes, because the only thing I'm a little sensitive to is that if there's $91 million in deferred gains, if those weren't eroded by actuarial losses, the amount of outstanding unfunded liability comes down dramatically. And I don't know if you just even did some, like you said, kind of quick and dirty comparisons as to what that might look like.
Other than, Tim, the analysis that we put on this page, where the direction of the contribution rate would go down by 10% of payroll, we haven't actually done the analysis. So in other words, we haven't included an analysis. We haven't done the analysis to determine how the contribution rate is expected to drop for the next 4 years, if that's the question. So it won't go down by 10% of payroll right away, but it would go down gradually. But we haven't done an analysis to determine how much they would go down, and the impact of the contribution rate going down, the impact of the reduction in the liability, and how that is going to translate into a reduction in the amortization schedule, how this is going to change the amortization payments and schedule. That is an analysis that we have not done.
Okay, thank you.
Director Forrester?
In our April meeting, we had an amortization schedule for these scenarios, and scenario 1 showed for the increase of $466,000 per year, it would be an $8 million over time interest savings on the unfunded liability. And that was that. I don't see that in this report, but that was in our April report to the board. So scenario 1 was 8 million savings in interest over time. Scenario 2 was 30 million, and that was bringing it down to 15 years instead of 1 year. So would it stand to reason that in scenario 4 here, keeping that rate the same and just based on the increase in contributions being 2.6 million versus scenario 1 that's 466,000, it's roughly 5 times the amount of savings than an interest. Would that, I mean, is that just too basic? I mean, if we're saving 8 million with 466,000, are we going to save 5 times that at 2.6 million?
Yeah, I think in rough terms that can be used as a ballpark. Yeah, so in other words, now just very quickly, just trying to remind myself that there are 4 scenarios that we have been asked by the board to complete as part of this valuation. These first 3 scenarios, 1, 2, and 3, are repeating the analysis that we did following the 2020 evaluation. The last scenario is new. The first scenario, as Julie has indicated, is to take the UAL amortization period for this restart layer. In this valuation, it would be 18 years left and bringing it down by 1 year to 17. So the question is, how much is that going to increase the contribution rate? So we'll look at that in a quick second. The other one would be to take the 18-year amortization, and rather than to take it down 1 year at a time, we'll go ahead and take it down by, let's say, 3 notches to 15 years, and starting with this year's valuation. Then last but not least, we know that the employer has been paying an amount of the for the POB, and the POB will be paid off starting with 2027-28. So the question was, if instead of budgeting or allowing the county's contribution budget for the plan and the POB to drop by this amount of about $4 million, what would have happened if we were to ask the employer to get ready to put the $4 million into the retirement association instead? So now, of course, the only difference between the first 2 and this scenario is there would be an immediate contribution rate increase outlay for the employer under 1 and 2. So even though as a result of this valuation, we are going to be seeing a very dramatic reduction in the cost, but nonetheless, item 3, at least for the time being, will not require the county to increase its contribution budget, because it's really an item. It's almost like a forewarning to the county that the budget may increase, and if so, by $4 million. But it's really up to the board at that point in time whether or not you want to pass on that contribution increase. Item 4 is more impactful, because instead of only increasing the contribution by a certain amount, such as what is in items 1 and 2, you're asking the employer to basically forego the contribution rate reduction of 3.3%, which is over $2.6 million that we have calculated as part of this valuation. So in very quick dollar terms, under item 1, where we're only increasing decreasing the amortization period by 1 year from 18 to 17, it would have a contribution rate impact of about 0.6% of payroll, or about $466,000. So in other words, even though there's a contribution rate reduction, but instead of the 3.3%, we're now looking at 3.3% minus the 0.58. So this actually reduced the savings by about 20%, roughly 1/5. Under the other scenario, now we're looking at reducing the amortization period, not just by 1 year, but rather by 3 years, because we are looking at a 15-year amortization. So this actually increase the contribution by 1.59% of payroll by 1.5% of $1.5 million. But nonetheless, these amounts are still lower than the contribution rate reduction we are recommending to the board today. So I think that's, so this is the 3 years. Now I'm going to skip over scenario 3, because that scenario really does not have an immediate impact. I'm going to go to scenario 5. So under scenario 5, now we're looking at taking back the entire 3.3% of payroll, which is about $2.6 million. So I think, Dirk, you mentioned early on that if we look at all these numbers, they're somewhat proportional. You would expect to see a 4-year reduction in the payment period to the restart layer, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I do have estimates on the interest savings if we're interested in that.
Yes, thank you.
Between what the current amortization schedule and the scenario 4, it's about $35 million in interest savings over the period.
So then I think on the last one, this again, scenario 3 is a almost like a information item if you decide to go that path, because this is really just informing the county, the employers, that there's a desire by the board in your future rate setting process for the 2027-28 fiscal year, not the 22-23, which we're recommending today, that you might be asking them to pay an additional $4 million. So nonetheless, we have included as part of this analysis, if the $4 million were to be paid, how is that going to translate into the reduction in the payment period for the UAL? But I would again caution the board that even though it is expected to reduce the payment period by about 3 years, but nonetheless, this is really just not something that is actionable, for example, by the on the employer's behalf, because all they possibly would do is to just build that into the budget, but it really does not impact. For example, when we present to you the valuation next year, how much the UAL for the plan is going to be, because there's no additional contribution that is expected to come into the plan anytime soon until the 27-28 fiscal year.
Director Forster.
I'm just pointing out that scenario 3 starts in 2028, as we can see here, but the scenario 4 would start immediately. And as Dirk was saying, that was a $35 million, I believe, savings. But when I just want to go back to scenario 2, bringing it down to 15 years, that's also a $30 million savings is what we were projected before. So I don't know if we want to look at combinations. I don't know about, scenario 1 to me is an actual no-brainer. Let's save $8 million. That seems like a minor change that wouldn't hurt our plan sponsor and would support, taxpayer liability, really bringing down that unfunded liability sooner. But I don't know that if scenario 4 is only $35 million and scenario 2 is $30 million, I believe that we should just maybe take a more of a cautious choice here and go with scenario 2 rather than say 4 and 2 or 4 and 1, or just with 4 completely. So I think we need to look at what they bring in the interest savings and the impact to our plan sponsors payment as well, sort of a blend on those two lenses when we make the decision.
Thanks. Director Anderson.
Yeah, for Andy, my recollection, and I'm not sure if you recall as well, I think that we've had at least one other time where we had a similar recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to just maintain the rate in the interest of paying off UAL. So it may be that the scenario 4 is one that at least historically they've seen before, and I think took favorable action on, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that one actually does not ring a bell. I know that the county, for example, has set up a task force to study the possibility to enhance, to improve the funding status of the plan. But I know that those times were when the contribution rate for the plan was expected to go up. So I know that it was very difficult for the employer to do anything but to pay the higher rate, but not the higher rate. So I'm drawing blanks because unfortunately, after Siegel was appointed as actuary for the fund, we have gone through. First, we have to deal with the financial crisis, and then followed by recommending the board approving high contribution rate because of assumption changes. So I'm trying to remember if we have actually come in and actually recommend years where the contribution rates were going to go down, but we decided to not recommend those lower rates. That's something that I don't remember off the top of my head.
Director Champmeyer.
Does Doris want to jump in there? Does she want to? Okay. No, you're good. Okay. So I just want to make sure that I understand on scenario 2, we would actually be dropping the amortization table from 18 years, on the restart layer from 18 to 15. Is that more of a, is this going to affect us down the road in a way that scenario 4 would not? I mean, are we still gonna, I guess I just want to understand more. How does 4 affect the amortization table? You said it was, I think you said it was 4 years. So I just want to know the difference between 2 and 4.
Right.
Like and I'm talking about how would it affect it in the long run? Would they both be ongoing and affected in the long run, no matter what?
Yeah, I think that definitely if the boards were to so choose to reduce the amortization period from, let's say, 18 years to the 15 years, it's I would use the word locked in. So we would actually lock in the higher rate going forward. So unless the board take another action to basically go back, and I don't think you will, but if the board were to say, well, next year was a tough year for whatever reason, and the contribution rate is going to go back, it's going to go up for other reasons. So unless the board take another action to lengthen the amortization period, again, you would not do that. But unless the board took another separate action, otherwise, the higher contribution rate of 1.95%, which is about roughly $1.5 million, would be locked in, and we would expect to see that high contribution rate to be paid for the next 15 years. So unless we take another action. On the other hand,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on the other hand, if the board were to decide to continue the higher rate of 37.44% for another year, so it's really up to the board at the time when we do present the next valuation, and assuming that the contribution rate will continue to trend down, right? Because I was talking about those investment gains, and plus the fact that we are imposing a higher rate from the 2021 valuation. So next year, instead of the contribution rate going down by 3.3%, this rate, let's say, can go down by 5%. So next year, we will need to come back to the board and ask the board to take another action, because at that point in time, the contribution rate that we calculate according to a routine execution of your funding policy will show the rate which is low. It could be even lower than the 3.3% that we calculate this year. It could be up to 5% lower, because if we were to take the investment gains into account. So now it's really up to the board next year to decide whether or not you want to take that action. If the board said, no, I don't want to take that action anymore, then the contribution rate will go down by the 3.33% again. So this is really not locked in, unlike scenario 2, where once you go to the bank and ask the bank to rearrange for the mortgage for the restart layer, the contribution rate will continue to be higher. But whereas here, this is really up to the board to decide at the time of the next valuation whether or not you want to impose a high contribution rate on the employer.
So we could lock in 2 and then really not have to address this for a while. As far as, I mean, it would be locked in and then that would be it. And then we wouldn't necessarily have to think about this every year. We would just kind of make a change like we did back in 2012, where we did something that we looked at the long term, how it affected it. And then we stuck with that. And then, now we're looking at it again. So, okay, thank you. That helps. Thank you.
If I can just clarify one thing on scenario 2, the earlier letter we had produced was going from 19 years down to 15 years, so a 4-year reduction. Now we're going from 18 to 15. So the $30 million interest savings was over a 4-year period. Over a 3-year period, it's about $22 million. So based on this report, we're looking at $22 million interest savings for scenario 2.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, only because I guess another year has come by, and we've now we charge the employer another years of interest on the UAL. So that's the difference, right?
That's right.
Doris?
Thank you, Chair Jurdy. Our ad hoc committee did speak with the executive office regarding the different scenarios back in April or May, whenever we met with the executive office. The executive office seemed open to looking at options. And I don't know if the board's intention is to adopt a method today that would then be required, or if there wants to be more discussion with the county regarding the options and the impact to the county. I think Jeff sort of had some concerns about that, and I wanted to see what the direction that the board may be looking at going here. Is it just adopting one of these scenarios, or engaging in further discussions, or making something optional?
So, I really think that we should take advantage of the fact that we have an opportunity to reduce we could in theory reduce the contribution rate, but instead maintain the current level and accelerate the payment of the unfunded liability. I think either scenario 2 or scenario 4 work, but I also would like to see us make that contribution. Would have liked to have seen us made the contribution several years ago of the county's pension gap reserve fund. Now we've not been able to take advantage of the growth in the market. I do have a question for Andy, and maybe this is a later question for Greg, but my understanding is that CalPERS is looking at the fact that, like everyone else, they had substantially higher than anticipated returns based on their assumed returns with the market. And because of that, they're actually looking at reducing their future expected returns, because their assumption is, well, the market may be more overvalued because it grew so much. And so I realize that's not really what we're talking about here, because we don't have a policy like CalPERS has, because that would affect the normal costs which is a hotly debated issue. But I'm just thinking of taking that caution that we could be looking at lower than expected returns in the future because the market grew so much and might be overvalued. I don't know if it is. I mean, Greg would have a stronger, and Robert and Doris would have stronger opinions on that than me. But I'm just knowing the fact that we're in something of an inflationary market, certainly more than we've seen for the last decade. We're in that also will affect salaries, that will also affect future retiree payments. I'm just thinking, given all those cautions, I would like to not see us backslide and reduce the county's contribution as a percentage of payroll. Again, scenario 2 kind of does it as well, more or less. It's a middle ground, you might say, between holding the line but scenario 4, I think, might be a little more flexible for the county, because what if there are just valuation problems in the future? It's a discretionary act, whereas scenario 2 kind of locks us in to a higher contribution rate, even if the market returns are not as we're hoping, and expenses are greater than expected. So I don't know. I'm just putting all those out there. I would like to see us not reduce our contribution rate by much if we do reduce our contribution rate. So interested in scenario 2, interested in scenario 4.
May I just jump in for a quick second and ask a kind of a fundamental question here, Andy? As I'm looking at 31453, and I recognize I'm the attorney and you're the actuary, but you do a lot of these. And I know there's been kind of a tension over the years, and I haven't looked at this issue in some time. I kind of want to make sure I'm understanding the fundamental decision and the authority that this board has today. When it makes its motion on accepting your valuation report, isn't it just recommending the contribution rates to the county as opposed to actually adopting the rates?
I think, Jeff, this is, of course, like you pointed out, the actuary's understanding of that section of the law. My understanding is that the section of the law uses the word like shall. That means that there's really no alternative action that the county can follow except to adopt a board. So my understanding is that, again, this is based on the actuary's understanding of the statute, is that the adoption of the contribution rate, once approved by the board, is really a formality on behalf of the board of supervisors, because usually when the board, after the board of retirement approves a set of rate, is really just one set. There's really no second set. Then at that point in time, it's really the county has to pay those contributors. So of course, that's based on the actuary's understanding of the statute.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. And so I suppose there could be a situation where a retirement board was seen by the county as perhaps too aggressive, and maybe there could be some pushback. But it sounds like there was some discussions already with the county. But I guess I think it would be good to just be a little bit mindful of the issue and the reaction of the county. Of course, we do have our chair is on the board of supervisors, and we have reached out to the CEO for the county. So I think we're okay to continue along with this discussion.
Okay, Director Shoemaker.
Thank you. So the first question I have is Trustee Forrester said something about $30 million in savings in scenario 2, but then another statement said 22 million. Can somebody clarify that?
That is correct. The 30 million was based on a prior study we had done based on the 2020 evaluation results. And at that time, the longest amortization layer was 19 years. So we went from 19 years to 15 years. In this update with the 2021 valuation, we're going from an 18-year layer to a 15-year layer. So instead of 4 years of interest, we're now talking about 3 years.
Okay, so the 22 mil is the actual in this scenario in today's presentation.
Correct.
So then I want to agree with Chair Churdy's comments. If as an individual, when you're planning your retirement and you're taking and put money in deferred comp or whatever, when it does well, you typically don't stop putting money in. Or you don't reduce how much money you normally put in unless there's something really important you have to buy. And I think if we looked at that philosophy, that this scenario 4, I will call it the windfall scenario, and that it gives us an opportunity and the county an opportunity to save $35 million in interest. And you know, even if you break that up, it's $2 million a year in interest if you break it up over 18 years. So that's pretty significant. So as far as an overall recommendation, I think another round of discussions with county admin about it to see if there's any major issues with it. But I think that the number 4 would be where this board should go. But again, a little more input from our sponsors. Thank you.
Great. Jeff?
Sorry, I'll lower my hand. My comment has already been addressed.
Thanks. Director Anderson?
Thank you. And I appreciate Sherry Schapmeyer's comments about locking something in, and actually it kind of deals with the whole generational equity issue at the same time if we were to adopt option 2, I believe it was. But I keep going back to option 4 and kind of concurring with Chair Jurdy and Member Shoemaker's remarks, is that if we went with option 4, really we don't know the future, and if the deferred actuarial gains hold up, then we don't want to. We may want to adjust rates favorably in the future. If they don't hold up, then we're not locked into a long-term amortization schedule, and we can look at things like rate of return and so forth going forward. I think with a little more flexibility than if we've locked in the that layer of UAAL for the reset. So for what it's worth, if we were to engage the county again, I'm inclined towards option 4.
Doris?
Not to muddy the water, but there is an option where the board could recommend rates that are higher than the 33 or 34% that was presented in the actuarial study, but lower than the current 37% to provide additional funding for the system, but yet give the employer a little bit of a break of the contribution rates that they've been paying. So I don't know particularly how the county's budget is looking up, but I can say in most places, there's always more projects than there is budget typically. And I don't know what the county is looking at, but it's something that we could have discussions perhaps with the CEO's office on. But there could be other options out there just than the specific scenario of maintaining the current 37.11 versus or whatever it is and dropping it to the 33 or 34.
Thank you. Director Cromer?
Thank you, Chair. And I really appreciate the discussion we're having here from Andy and Dirk and the input you guys are providing. I want to voice my opinion that I very much agree with the comments made by Chair Jurdy and Trustee Shoemaker that I think 4 it warrants additional conversations with the plan sponsor, because I don't want to, based on Andy's comment, impose something on them without having further conversation with them. And it sounds like if we do vote and take action on this, it's almost imposed on the board to accept what we've done. And I think it does warrant further conversation that's the direction if it is the board's direction that we're leaning towards, that it warrants additional conversation with the plan sponsor. And I also, Jim's comments not lost on me either. I'm very curious to see if there was a recommendation or action taken by this board in the past where there was the ability to lower the contribution rate, but we chose not to, or the retirement board chose to maintain the current one and use that even in our conversation with the plan sponsor, say this has happened in the past and this is the benefit. Because I feel like the longer we delay taking action on one of these scenarios, the less savings we're going to get. We're seeing the significant difference between plan 2, just between what would have been 19 years to 15 to now 18 years to 15. So I feel like it is the time to take action and continue those conversations with the plan sponsor. Again, with mentioning that I think all of us on the board think plan 3 is a no-brainer. And even though it's a future potential savings for the county, I'm looking at 3 and 4 in my mind of compounding the savings potentially of interest.
Thank you. Director Forster?
So on the ad hoc committee, we met with Trustee Schattmeyer and Supervisor Jurdy and CEO Angelo and Assistant CEO Darcy Antle, and they can refresh my memory if there were any other parties there, but we did already have this discussion with the county during the ad hoc committee. And I'll tell you, my perception of it is that they were open to this. There was discussion about scenario 1, and then there was, and using the pension gap reserve funds, but there was also discussion about a blend between 1 and 3, which was essentially 2 years. So taking scenario 1 and doing it for 2 years. So I guess I have some concerns about not taking action today and making a choice on one of these when this is our opportunity to make an impact to that unfunded liability. But I do see that scenario 4 is $2.6 million. So that might be something that's out of what we had discussed, which was scenario 1, 466,000. Scenario 2 was 1.5. So somewhere in the middle there is $800,000. So I'm concerned about further delaying it, further going back to the plan sponsor, furthering those discussions when they were already had and they were open to them.
Okay, Director
May I
Shoemaker?
make a suggestion?
Okay, go ahead.
So I think that the board can do some type of action or take some type of action, perhaps in the alternative, where you're approving at least the minimum rates and giving some direction to either an ad hoc group or to your executive director to have some communication with the county to try to go as aggressive as your board is comfortable and as aggressive as the county is. So perhaps something can be styled in the alternative as opposed to coming back, which would take 6 weeks until your next meeting, because this is early November and we don't come back till mid-December. So just throwing out an option.
Okay, Director Shoemaker.
So if we were to adopt scenario 4, I mean, scenario 2 actually memorializes a reduction to a 15-year plan. Scenario 4 knocks down what's owed, but when this valuation is done, looked at in a year or 3 years, how do you keep the what I'll call the gain in savings or the lessening of time in place? I'm probably not being very articulate, but the concept to me is 2 locks everything in. 4 does a good job, gets us more money at the end, but only if a similar program continues. What would be a suggested way to memorialize that so the savings in time is kept?
If I may address that through the chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what can be done is, assuming the board is leaning towards first adopting scenario 2. So then what we would do is to, instead of the funding valuation report showing a rate of 34.11%, so now we would be, I don't think it would require us to redo the funding valuation report, but the report would really now say the contribution rate from now on is going to be set at 36.06% of pay. So all the employers should be expected to pay this rate for starting with the 2022-23 fiscal year and from that point on out. However, if the board were to say that this is the bare minimum, this is the minimum, but you're inclined to adopt the rate which is higher, right? So now, if instead of showing a contribution rate in our report which is equal to 36.06% of pay, now you are floating the possibility, the alternative, that the rate can go up by another, the difference between the 3.33 and the 1.95%, so by another 1.4% to the 37.44. So that may perhaps be the alternative that you want to have discussed with the county and the other employers before you actually go ahead and do this adoption. So maybe the difference is the scenario 2, the higher rate of 36.06 is kind of locked in. So all you're trying to discuss, find out from getting input from the employer is whether or not they would also be in support of the rate for this current fiscal year be set at the 37.44%, knowing full well that this 37.44% is only the higher rate for 1 year. If next year you decide not to take a similar action, the rate will stay at 36.06%, assuming that there are no other actuarial gains.
Thank you, Director Schattmeyer.
So I'm not part of the budget team or anything, but just in the conversations that we did have with the CEO's office, and Doris was there, I think, and presented information, a lot of information. To me, especially with all the raises that have been locked in over the last 3 years, which were desperately needed, I feel like the county, I get it right now that there's a difference of what $2.6 million between what the rate could be this year and what it was this last year. But it feels like that, to me, the county, they would be looking at this like I would think they would almost be happy if it stayed flat. Like if it didn't go up from this, the year we're in right now. To me, I would think that they would be expecting that figure to increase, particularly if they're not looking at the markets and all that stuff, but looking at the fact that there were some major raises given. And if it remained flat, I got the impression I mean, that would almost be like a win if it stayed flat. So I just, that's what I gathered from the meeting that I was in. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay, thank you. Director Forster.
So if we can look at page 31, and I can just get some clarification from Andy. If we let the rates go down to 34.11%, aren't we showing there in line 7 that the county would save on their unfunded liability payment $1.1 million? So if that's true, and we were to take scenario 2, which cost 1.5 million, they're actually netting 400,000 in a payment. Is that correct?
Andy, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think here the total contribution amount is $27.5 million versus the $28 million. So the difference is about $3 million. So that's about half of the distance between what we show under scenario 2. Yeah, so I think that is right.
So and we're just looking at rows or line 7 there, right? The payment on the unfunded. In 2021 is 1.1 million roughly in 2020.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, one of the problems of using page 31 is we're using 2 different payroll bases here. The 2020 numbers are based on last year's payroll, so that's a little bit different than what we show in the back of the report.
So in other words, to add on to, thank you for the clarification, Dirk. So in other words, when we do this calculation, this was from last year's report. This
Yes.
$75 million was before the 7% of payroll increase that I was talking about several minutes ago. So after we take into account the 7.5% increase in the payroll, the UAL contribution would have gone up anyway.
Okay, I want to call on Director Shatmeyer, but first I just want to, I think most people here know this, but just remind ourselves that roughly 48% of the county's payroll comes from state and federal sources, and about 52% comes from local taxes, otherwise known as the general fund. So, not all of these contributions are coming from the discretionary part of the county budget. Some of it is basically a reimbursement from the state and federal government. So the hit, in my point is the hit on the discretionary local tax base is not as great as it might appear. Director Shatmeyer. Okay. Do we have any more questions or comments at this time? Director Anderson.
I'm just kind of seeking clarification from both Jeff and Andy. I can appreciate the need to do something in a timely manner given the amount of time before our next meeting, and that it would be probably be wise to actually adopt a rate today. And if I'm understanding Andy correctly, is that the board could adopt the rates reflected in scenario 2, which locks in a more rapid reduction in the UAAL, but with a alternative or supplemental motion to the Board of Supervisors that the Board of Retirement recommends retaining the rates equal to the 2020 rates. It's essentially almost like a 2-tiered motion for the Board of Supervisors.
Andy, I don't know if you're looking for me to go first.
Yeah, please do. I was going to say that. Let's jump over.
And I mean, I think as long as this board takes the required action, it can certainly ask the Board of Supervisors to take a more aggressive one, or as part of a recommendation. Is there any reason they can't do it that way, Andy?
No, I don't think so. Although I have to admit, though, that even though it's very logical to do it that way, but I have actually not seen that done in practice. I know that the opportunity has only recently presented itself, right? That the contribution rate in the actuarial valuation report is going down. So what would the Board of Supervisors want to do with respect to the savings? I know that in years past, it's actually the exact opposite. The rates are going up, and for that reason, I know that there were more of those conversations where we know that the Board of Retirement has to make the tough choice to impose those high rates and therefore not give the employer any alternative. So I think maybe this is a new era that we are in, but I know that in practice we have not seen two set of rates being presented to the Board of Supervisors, even though it's very logical.
Director Comer, then I wanted to say something.
Thank you, Chair. If I misphrase this or misrepresent it, please interrupt, Andy, but I like the idea of setting a basement level that's set of the 36.06 and setting that rate, and then that's taking definitive action by this board that I believe needs to be adopted or has to be adopted by the Board of Supervisors with a side caveat recommendation to say, we're also making the recommendation of this higher rate to further impact this UAAL, and then leave that up to the board. And in my mind, that would absolve us of having that further communication or doing that further research in our presentation to the board, and still taking significant action to impact this situation. So it's sort of a two-part idea, but I do like that hybrid recommendation that Andy and I believe a few others have talked about.
If I may, if the board decides to take that route, perhaps the board may want to kind of tie the county, the court, and the cemetery district together. So in other words, when the other alternatives are to pay the high rate is provided to the plan sponsors, you want them to act collectively as a group, right? So we don't want the county to pay a high rate, but not the court nor the cemetery district, because we are cost sharing plan. So we just want to make sure that when we set the UAEL contribution rate, everybody, the three general employers, is paid the same contribution rate. So it would be preferable from the actuary's perspective to have the three employers act in lockstep. So that way, when the higher contribution rate is paid, then all three employers would be paying the high rate as opposed to only the county, but not the other two plan sponsors.
Okay, question for Andy or Jeff or Doris. Could we adopt a motion as Director Cromer just articulated, but also request that the county contribute roughly $4 million in its pension gap reserve immediately, which would further reduce the unfunded liability as part of the plan? But again, as a recommendation. So just as the recommendation, it would be that they would go ahead with the maintaining the current contribution rate, but would just also recommend a second action, which would be to contribute the pension gap fund.
Chair Jurdy, if I can respond to your comment, I think we could put forward to the Board of Supervisors the required rate, but also then make an optional item where they could choose to apply some of the pension gap funds. Is that what you're asking? And I think that would be doable. Then it would just be the rate that the board is going to advance to the Board of Supervisors, whether that's continuation of the current rate or one of the other proposals in the plan.
Okay. Director Shoemaker.
Yeah, I guess we're creating an alternative 5 here. I did the calculation from page 31, and the actual payroll number is higher. So that is a page that using that number is doesn't work quite right. But so scenario, we're not talking about adopting scenario 2. We're talking about taking the contribution rate and applying it, which does not reset the start layer. Or the other alternative is 4, which actually, to me, holds up against the pay increases, as well as to some degree the new staffing with the pay increases. And if there is another $2.6 million freed up in the county's budget, then it's likely that that money will go toward increasing staffing costs, which to me sounds like a snowball rolling downhill. So I hate to delay it, but I think scenario 4, unless there's a wild protest about it with the sponsors, is our best bet. And if that's not the case, then scenario 2 in its entirety would be adopted. Thank you.
Director Schantmeyer.
Thank you. And so the only thing, it sounds like there's a little apprehension about locking something in for 3 years. Change it, like actually changing the amortization table. Is there anybody that would be willing to say maybe do the 1 year, like incorporate it so that we're not going from 18 to 15, maybe going from 18 to 17, but still locking in some higher rates, still taking a higher dollar amount, but getting something locked in for the future that actually does make it so that we are making a change that will affect us for the future. I mean, we've got, like, I think Julie mentioned, we got, 1 and 3 years, and it does feel like there's, there's a concern about people about locking in something for 3 years for, but it sounds like, but maybe we do want to take this opportunity to lock in 1 year or 2 years and lower that and make a meaningful adjustment with that affects it for the entire amortization table. So I'm open to anything. I was going, 2 and 4 are what I'm gravitating to as well. So I mean, I'm open to whatever the board wants to do.
Chair Jurdy, I will try not to comment one more time. I look at this scenario for the quote unquote windfall scenario as a $35 million interest savings over time. If you don't take scenario 4, you lose the opportunity, again, amortized, of having $2 million a year more go into the county budget for the next 18 years. And is that a reasonable outcome? And I think that's part of it, is these compounding interest costs that I can remember when the POBs were put in. I was part of the group that was analyzing it, and the numbers that would happen in the first year or 2 years were scary if it didn't pay off. And so I think in this case, in the scenario 4, we have the opportunity to actually reduce the principal debt we're facing, and again, save $35 million.
So I'm curious if Andy has the figures right now, or if we took a break, if we could get the numbers when we came in from a break. But if, for example, we adopted a 15-year payback, which locks in a contribution rate that is lower than what the county was budgeting on prior to the recent windfall in the stock market, and at the same time contributed the $4 million in the pension gap reserve, my hunch is that it actually accelerates the payment. Well, we would lock in a 15-year payback. We'd save 3 years in interest, but I think we would save more in interest, obviously, than is shown currently on scenario 2, because we would also have the benefit of the $4 million payment into the investment fund. So I'm just kind of curious if you either have the information that could calculate the interest savings on the $4 million contribution coupled with scenario 2, or is that something you could calculate during a break and bring back to us?
I think thank you for offering us the opportunity, but I think I would be more comfortable in actually doing that later on. Only reason why I'm saying that is I think, unlike scenario 3, sounds like the $4 million contribution would be paid right away, right? As opposed to what we have contemplated in under scenario 3. So I'm just afraid that while we can do things on the fly, I'm just afraid that if the decision is hinged on the interest savings, then we want to get it right, and then it would just take more time than what we have during the break to get it right. So if it is okay with the chair and the other members of the board, I would rather come back once we have more time to actually crunch the numbers and check the results and make sure everything is fine. So I appreciate the gravity of this decision, but I want to make sure that we have the right answer as opposed to an answer that we give and later on may have to come back and correct.
Okay. Well, do people feel they feel comfortable making a motion at today's meeting, or are they looking to postpone this for an alternate meeting, or they want to make a recommendation, take an action, but make a supplemental recommendation? What's the interest of the board?
Just as a reminder, through the chair, we haven't had public comment yet. I realize it may be a preliminary step before that, but just a reminder.
Well, maybe this would be a good chance to go to the public comment. Do we have any public comment in this agenda item?
There's no public comment at this time.
Vice Chair Smith. Your audio is off. Your audio is off.
I couldn't find my picture because there's so many others on here. So I just want to know if Doris might have, I would like to hear her thoughts on the 4 scenarios and what she might think would be a approach that we might want to take.
As mentioned earlier, the CEO's office is open to contributing more to see the future savings as far as the interest cost on that unfunded liability. So I think it makes sense. Any of these options are probably viable. I think in some regards, there could be concern, as someone mentioned, with moving to the 15-year amortization, because you're locking in that higher amortization payment for 15 years. So you could look at doing something similar as to what Chair Jurdy suggested, where you're selecting a rate now with the request that the county fund an additional $4 million from their pension shortfall contingency reserve, whatever the name of that fund is. And that would augment a higher contribution rate to sort of snowball the interest savings on the unfunded liability. So I think any of the items proposed are good alternatives. That's probably not all that much help, but I don't think you can really go wrong with any action taken to further reduce the UAL and have our plan sponsors experience interest savings by paying that UAL down sooner.
Director Shatmeyer.
Thank you. So this does not go into effect until July, right? Is from what I understand, July, it's 22, 23. So it's almost like we have time. It feels like maybe we do need to think about this a little bit more and have them come back at the next meeting and get it right, because it does feel like we have an opportunity here to do something that maybe will really help the unfunded liability. So I mean, I just don't know if there's any time issues. It doesn't really sound like there's a time issue if we push this back a little bit.
If I could comment to Trustee Shatmeyer's comment, we typically have taken this to the Board of Supervisors, I think in February. So there is some time for the board to make a decision. Certainly giving the county the heads up so they can build it into their budget projections as they work into the end of this fiscal year so they can prepare for next fiscal year. I'm sure they would appreciate getting the information sooner rather than later. So as the board works through this in the next meeting or so, we could look at trying to, take this item to the board still in January, February timeframe. I don't think if you wait one meeting that it's going to necessarily delay us taking this to the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, based on that, what if we had the ad hoc committee reconvene and meet with the CEO's office and explore these different options to accept all the options that we've got in front of us, and then we will have some feedback for our next meeting. Does that sound like a good route, Director Cromer?
Thank you, Chair. And with that, I agree with that plan of action personally, because I feel like it's a more deliberate action, and then we are hopefully more comfortable with the action we decide to take. With the recommendation that ad hoc goes forward, I would also like them to consider hybrid models of potentially like a scenario 2, where we're locking in that rate with a recommendation to the board to maintain the current contribution rate of the 37.44, and an additional recommendation that they contribute that 4 million from the pension gap fund to the UAL. So if there is some interest from the board in a recommendation like that, I think all three of those things could have a positive impact on this situation.
Thank you. Doris?
Did you want to have Siegel provide any additional information, perhaps on interest savings, if we did, let's say, that hybrid approach that Trustee Cromer just put forward, where the county maintains the current contribution rate, but also makes an additional payment from the pension gap fund?
I think we would like that additional analysis. And I guess the other one would be if there was the 15-year payment, but so this year if next year's was to drop to 36%, but with the $4 million payment. So I think those would be the two additional pieces of information that we don't have right now.
Okay, could I just reiterate those to make sure I understand the two items? So as previously discussed, maintain the current contribution rate and an additional $4 million from the pension gap funding would be scenario 1 to have Siegel model. Scenario 2 would be dropping the amortization of the restart layer to a 15-year period and including an additional $4 million from the pension gap fund. Is that correct, Chair Jurdy, or did you have a third component of that?
Those are the two scenarios I think that we don't have, but in my mind would be helpful for the county and for us.
Thank you. Let me request or ask the Siegel representative, would it be possible for you to provide this additional information before our next board meeting in December?
We should be able to do that.
And would we be able to have that early enough that perhaps our ad hoc committee could meet with the county executive office, so when we do our meeting on December 15th, the board would already have that feedback from the county along with your recommendation? So I think we'd probably need it not later than the first week of December in order to still arrange a meeting with the executive office. Does anybody else see issues with the timeline?
I'm looking at Dirk, and so Dirk, please feel free to say, but I think we should have enough time to get it done by the first week of December.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Director Anderson?
Thank you. My only comment is, and I think everything, we should discuss, the ad hoc should discuss this as broadly as possible with the county representatives. The only discomfort I'm feeling, and I'm not sure if anybody else does, is that when we're talking about scenarios 1, 2, and 4, we're talking about things that are under control of the Board of Retirement and under our authority. When we start talking about pension reserve fund, or we start talking about kind of freed up debt service payments on the POBs, we really start talking about things that are under the Board of Supervisors purview, I think. And if that were the case, I would say that if if something like that were to come to the Board of Supervisors, we may want to look at kind of like companion proposals where there is a rate proposal from the Board of Retirement and there's a pension gap payment proposal that comes from county administration. Just a thought as far as keeping authorities clear.
Good point. Director Cromer?
I agree with Trustee Anderson's comments, and I think if we could maintain the naming as far as the scenarios are concerned for the executive director, I think that ad hoc to talk to the county about scenario 2 and 4, that's what we're talking about, and then these hybrid, if we can name those 2A, scenario 2A and 4A, just to maintain consistency in the name so we don't get confused moving forward. But the way I was envisioning it in my mind is these hybrids would be, we're locking in either 2 or 4 as far as a rate with the recommendation to the Board of Supervisors and the plan sponsors about this pension gap fund. So it would still be in effect doing what is within our ability to do with a recommendation to the plan sponsors about the pension gap.
So when we would move forward to the Board of Supervisors, what I'm hearing is we would recommend the rate based on, let's say, scenario 2 or 4 or whatever rate the board chooses to adopt. The other part is an optional consideration for the Board of Supervisors based perhaps on recommendation from the CEO's office or to combine that benefit by doing an additional payment from the pension reserve, which is optional, but the setting of the rate itself is not optional as we know, but giving the Board of Supervisors flexibility on whether or not to make the payment from their pension gap fund.
Thank you. Director Forster?
During our discussion in the ad hoc committee in making with these scenarios 1 and 2 and 3, I don't think we had 4 at that time. The discussion was that they would use the pension gap fund in order to address these increases. So really what we're talking about, and that is their decision how they find their budget, their money in their budget. But they were discussing using the pension gap fund in order to cover scenario 1 or scenario 2, for example. So now we're ultimately saying use your pension gap fund for that, and also let's use another 4 million. So I just want to be clear that all of these costs in the discussion was from pension gap. They weren't separate. So really we're saying 4 million plus 1.5 in scenario 2. So we're talking 5.5 from the pension gap fund. So I don't know the level, the amount in that fund. I don't know if Supervisor Jurdy does, but I just want to make sure the point of this is stability of payroll, right? And so our plan sponsors can budget. And so that's why we had the discussion in the ad hoc about the pension gap fund might be something they could utilize to pay this and then not be impacted in their normal course of their budget. So I just want to point that out. It's all coming in our discussions was coming from the pension gap fund. So now if we're asking for more, that could be a problem.
Director Cromer?
Thank you, Chair. If I can ask, I guess, from Trustee Forrester, were they of the belief for funding these increases in the pension from the pension gap fund that we would be increasing the contribution rate? Because the way I'm looking at scenario 2 and 4, scenario 2 is actually lowering it and 4 is maintaining the same. So if they don't have to use that pension gap funding to fund the increase, then they could use it in another fashion. So I don't see it the same way, I guess, unless I'm misunderstanding your comment.
No, that's a good point. We didn't discuss in my memory that the rate would go down. So that is true. They sort of offset each other. If the rate goes down and then we select scenario 2, that's how their budget is made up. Yes.
So through the chair, if I may make a comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, so in other words, the only time that, looking at the county first before talking about the two other employers, the only time that the county's contribution rate actually would go up would be under scenario 4, together with the possibility of making an additional $4 million from the pension contribution gap fund. I think for the two other employers though, because I go back to the cost sharing multiple employer contribution rate setting process. So if the county were to be in support of scenario 4 plus $4 million in pension contributions from the gap fund, I just don't know whether or not we have found out from for example, from the court, whether or not they would be able to afford to make similar contributions, because I just don't know if they would have a gap fund that they can tap into to make those additional dollar contribution, whatever that proportional contribution would be required from the court and from the cemetery district.
Okay, well, we may request, Andy, that you participate by phone or Zoom into this meeting with the CEO's office. Okay.
We'd be more than happy to participate.
Okay, great. So maybe I don't know if we need a motion, but we could just have by direction of the chair that the ad hoc committee will be presenting additional information and these options with a meeting with the CEO's office prior to our December meeting for feedback for this action item at our December meeting.
Direction is sufficient.
Okay.
Chair Jurdy, could I ask whether or not the board wishes Siegel representative to be available at the December meeting? I'm assuming you do, but I just wanted to confirm that.
I think we need them here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I know that on that same day, I have to make a presentation at another client, but I'm sure that we can arrange to have Dirk participate together with Paul Angelo.
Okay, does this conclude this item for today? And maybe we should take a short break and come back for the rest of our agenda. It's essentially 10:30. Maybe we could come back at 10:40.
Okay.
Okay, so it's 10:40. It looks like we're back in session. I believe we have, I do see we have Callan here, but we do have, I believe we still have item 4 with Siegel, which is discussion regarding the June 30th, 2021 Government Accounting Standards GASB 37 Actuarial Valuation. Do we need to take up that item first? Okay, so Andy, would you like to lead some discussion on this?
Yeah, actually, I will turn to my partner, Dirk Thompson, and Dirk has promised that it will be very quick. So with that, I will just share my screen to just go through a couple of pages of the report with you. Dirk, so please take it away.
Sure. Andy, if I could have you start on page 7, please. So this is the GAS 67 valuation, accounting valuation for the plan. Just to take you through a couple terms as a reminder. We're looking at the middle column, the June 30, 2021. The second item down is the total pension liability. That's similar to the actuarial accrued liability in the funding valuation report. There's a slight difference. There are several members at MCERA that work for multiple plans and tiers. Under the funding report, it is assumed that the current tier and membership has always been in place. For this GASB report, we reflect the actual movement between the tiers and the different plans. So this liability is just slightly higher than the actual accrued liability in the funding report. The third item down is the plan's fiduciary net position. These are the assets at the market value, unlike the funding valuation, which is at a smooth market value. This is the full market value. Next item down is the net pension liability. That's basically an unfunded liability on a market value basis. So you can see that dropped from $256 million last year to $123 million this year. The primary reason is the great return on the market value of assets of over 30%. There's more detail on page 16 about how we got from last year's numbers to this year's numbers, again in the middle column. Down at the bottom, there's a couple of ratios. There's a funding ratio somewhat near the bottom. That's basically the same funding ratio Andy mentioned in the funding report. This is total pension liability over the market value of assets, right, almost 85%. There's another reporting figure where they express the unfunded or the net pension liability as a percent of actual covered payroll. Actual payroll for the year ended June 30, 2021 came in at 77 million. So that ratio dropped significantly from 356% last year to 160% this year. Go backwards one page, please, Andy. So the middle column reiterates the 123 million net pension liability under the 6.75% assumption. There's a sensitivity test on what happens if you increase or decrease that interest rate assumption by a full 1%. And so that then changes the net pension liability by the range we see here. One final page is page 20. This is a progression of the fund based on the current census information as of June 30, 2021. It projects out the employer and employee contributions and the benefit payments, takes into account administrative expenses and projected earnings. This illustrates that there's enough money in the fund to support the 6.75% interest rate assumption. We get a little discounted value down at the year 21-24 of $7 million. That's basically the amount that's currently sitting in the contingency reserve. So that's basically the end of the prepared remarks. I don't know if Andy had any additional thing he wanted to bring to your attention. But...
No, other than the fact that compared to the funding report where we are setting the contribution rates for our members and as well as for the employer. This is really for accounting financial disclosure purposes. So later on, we are going to be preparing a companion report that would be utilized by the employer, including the county, for their financial disclosure. So even though we don't want to minimize the importance of this, but otherwise, this is really just for a financial accounting disclosure as opposed to setting the hard dollar contributions that we expect to get from our employer and the employee.
I don't know, the board had any questions, or otherwise that concludes the presentation of the 67 report.
All right, well, thank you. Any questions or comments? Do we have any public comments in this item?
There is no public comment on this item.
Okay, well, thanks for the update, and obviously it's good news. We welcome that. Okay, then that does bring us over to Callan's update regarding investment matters, quarterly investment performance report, and the full report.
Well, great, and what a great discussion about contribution and funding policy. I really enjoyed listening to that, and thought it was a very deliberative, thoughtful, and respectful discussion. We are, Claire and I, we are going over third quarter performance. Well, your first quarter, the third calendar year, third quarter for calendar year, I should say. And I'm going to share my screen if that's okay with everyone. So give me a second to do so. Okay. Everyone see the presentation okay? Wonderful. All right. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the capital market backdrop, and then hand it over to Claire to talk about your specifics for your plan. And it was a flattish quarter, ended September. However, it was a spectacular year. And Andy was alluding to this, very strong returns. Naturally, his returns are through June 30. We're looking through September 30 here. Nevertheless, the one-year returns ended September are still extraordinarily strong. And it's all of the rebound from COVID and none of the drawdown from COVID. So the one-year number is a bit deceiving because if you look over 2 years and 3 years, they're still positive, but not quite as exceptional as the last 12 months. A few big takeaways here for the periods ended September. You'll see that US stocks and large cap were essentially flat. Small cap stocks lost ground though, down about 4%. International stocks were also roughly flat, with the exception of emerging markets. Emerging markets were down about 8%. If you dig under the hood in there, China, which is the largest component of the emerging market equity index, was down about 20%, and Brazil was also down about 20%. So big drawdowns in a couple of the largest components within emerging market equity. You see the bond market had returns that were essentially close to zero. And in a couple slides, you'll see with one exception, and that's inflation-linked bonds. And then real estate, recall we had some educational sessions on real estate in the middle of COVID, worrying about, well, what is the valuation of real estate looking like in light of COVID? Real estate was actually up 5% for the quarter and about 12% for the year. So all in, real estate, because we emerged from COVID, actually held up pretty well. Final thing I'll point on is the commodity and gold market, which feeds into inflation. There's been a lot of talk about inflation. Is it elevated over a short term or perpetually elevated? We're still in the camp that inflation is going to be elevated on a transitory basis, but the longer we say that, the more likely we could be wrong. And we are still in the camp of transitory, and we will come back towards an inflation rate closer to 2% But over the last year, we are running at inflation at about a 5% rate. We think the market will figure this out in the long run. We will start getting the goods and products through the supply chain, but it'll take a little bit of time. Oil right now is priced at about $81 a barrel. That's a lot higher than it was before. However, if you look at the price of commodities, and this applies to oil, the largest component of the commodity index, over the last 10 years, it's still negative 2.6% on an annualized basis. So that means commodities in general are still 25 to 30% in price lower than they were 10 years ago. So they're going up a lot over the last year, but they're coming off from what some could say is a lower base than we've seen in the past. So a couple quick snapshots on the U.S. equity market for the quarter. I mentioned large caps were roughly flat, small caps lost ground. However, for the last year, look at those returns in the green over on the far right. We're looking at 30 to 40% returns for 12 months ended in September. This has been driving the price returns across our entire portfolio. If you look at international stock markets, see again pretty flat, but we see a pretty big drawdown in China and emerging markets in general. So it was flat, but pretty big dispersion once you dig underneath the hood. Within the fixed income market, I mentioned the one exception for strong returns in the quarter were actually here, the inflation-linked bond market, the TIPS market. So with inflation coming in at a higher price, those inflation-linked bonds are appreciating in value more than they would otherwise. So they actually had a pretty strong quarter. Thought that was interesting with inflation being top of everyone's mind right now. And with inflation, this chart dissects it a little bit and says, okay, where's inflation coming from? And one thing to note is you'll see that inflation has been driven by a couple small components here. One is used cars and trucks. The price increase since February 2020 for this segment is 40%. So used cars and trucks for this core CPI measure is only about 3% of that index, that inflation index. But if it's 3% and it's up 40%, that still adds a full percentage point to the measure of inflation. So one reason we think this is transitory is that over time, we think, the used car market should sort itself out. We don't expect used cars to appreciate 40% per annum in perpetuity, right? So that's why we think, that's just an example of why we think over the long run, we think inflation will come back down towards a more normal rate. Notably, in about 5 minutes or 6 minutes, we'll see what the Fed has to say about their perspective of inflation and if they will start tapering as most people expect. And we kind of expect them not to increase short-term interest rates until the back half of next year at the earliest. So we'll see if Chairman Powell proves me wrong in about 6 minutes. With that, we'll flip ahead and start talking specifically about the plan. Now I'll hand it over to Claire.
Sure. So starting here on page 9, we always like to take a step back and look at not just the recent quarter, but total plan growth over time. So this shows total plan growth over the last 15 years. And the biggest takeaway is that the plan, the investment program, has grown from about $300 million 15 years ago to about $700 million today. And you can see that significant growth and the path that it's taken in that top chart. Focusing in on the most recent time period on the far right, you can see that consistent with the capital markets and the overview that Greg gave, the portfolio was essentially flat for the quarter, down very slightly. but you can see that in the blue line. We saw the very dramatic recovery in the capital markets and then recovery beyond where we were at the start of 2020 in your portfolio, and then a pretty flat quarter in this most recent time period. So the portfolio ending the quarter ended September 30th with $692 million in total. On the next page, page 10, we look at the actual asset allocation of your portfolio as of the end of September as compared to the strategic target. And no surprise, the actual asset allocation remains right in line with that strategic target, consistent with the guidelines outlined in the investment policy statement. Now, one thing to note, and that we've talked about in the last few quarters, is that infrastructure allocation. So the target currently shows a 3% allocation to infrastructure. And as you know, the full weight of the target to infrastructure is actually 6%. As only one of your infrastructure managers that you committed capital to has called that capital to date, we show half of that total portfolio weight at this time. So JP Morgan is the one infrastructure manager that did call capital in the second quarter, and we're waiting for the full quarter of updated returns for that manager for the September performance report. So that'll be updated as soon as we get that information, and we'll see that in the performance section. Notably, the second manager, IFM, did close an acquisition just in the last few weeks here that should cause them to call your capital. So we would expect that the full weight of the infrastructure allocation is in place by the end of this year. So more to come there. On the next slide, slide 11, we look a little bit deeper. So it's a detailed asset allocation of the plan as of the end of the quarter. And along the bottom, we look at just the plan growth in the last quarter. So the investment program started the quarter at the end of June with just shy of $700 million, $696 million in total. Saw investment returns that were slightly negative, so negative down about $1.5 million from investment returns, and then about $2 million flowed out of the plan largely for benefit payments. So ending the quarter again with $692.5 million as of the end of September. Pretty simple as in terms of cash movements in the plan during the quarter. No significant rebalances, just cash raised from the S&P 500 index fund there, again to the tune of about $2 million. The other thing I always check on this page is that all of your investment managers within each asset category remain in balance as intended. So that's all in good order. On the next slide, we get into performance. So performance at the total fund level. Again, the total fund, we show a negative 24 basis point return for the quarter. Again, that's inclusive of a preliminary flat return for the 3% allocation to infrastructure. So that'll be updated. But again, essentially flat for the quarter. And the total fund benchmark up 14 basis points. One thing that struck me when I looked at this chart specific to the last quarter is just how compressed the returns of the peer group are. So when looking at how did other public fund sponsors do in this recent time period, given the flat returns out of the domestic equity market, negative returns from international equity, pretty modest returns from fixed income, again, real estate being a bright spot, especially in your portfolio, it was hard for plan sponsors to eke out much return in this quarter. So that peer group ranging from negative 76 basis points to a positive just 35 basis points. Now, importantly, over longer time periods, returns for your program remain excellent. Over the trailing year, up over 24%, well ahead of the total fund benchmark, and over longer term time periods, solid returns and in most cases ahead of the total fund benchmark as well. Over the trailing 10-year time frame, up 10.64%. over all of those timeframes, again, faring very well versus other public fund peers as well. So certainly continued good news. On page 13, we look at fiscal year performance. So breaking down total fund performance in individual fiscal years. Of course, the most recent quarter is the fiscal year to date time period. We finished a full fiscal quarter at the end of the last quarter, June 30th. And that 31.83% return for the 2021 fiscal year, of course, being what Andy was referring to in his reports, the strong returns that benefited your funded status last year. Now, between this page and the next page, page 14, we show fiscal year performance for the trailing 9 years, individual fiscal years. And I went through and looked, and 8 out of the 9 are actually positive. So consistent with what we'd expect from what we've seen in this strong market environment in the last decade, but certainly good news and adding to that long-term trend of growth in the total portfolio. And also in 6 of the last 9 fiscal years, you've outpaced your total fund target. So pretty good track record there when looking at a fiscal year time period cadence. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to page 17 and focus in on attribution. What's driven those strong returns and strong relative returns in particular for the plan? So this looks at attribution over the recent 1- and 5-year time periods. Over the recent year, again, the plan up 24.4%, outpacing its target return of 20.6%. And the majority of that driven by the active management employed in the plan. And that's just what you'd expect. Some residual effect from asset allocation as market movements move the asset allocation versus the target slightly out of line here and there. But the majority coming from positive manager effect, 3.35% on a relative basis over the target for the last year. So when you look from an asset category perspective, equity in the last year, your equity implementation of both domestic equity and international equity have been the largest drivers of that. Fixed income also being strongly positive. You see a slightly negative contribution from infrastructure. Again, we have a temporary flat return and as we're waiting those final results, so that will update when the JP Morgan results come in. Slightly negative manager effect from real estate. Again, your real estate managers have done quite well, that asset category in particular, contributing to the total fund return. But in total, the real estate composite did lag the benchmark just slightly. No concerns from our perspective, though. Similar story over 5 years. Equity, domestic equity and international equity, both contributing positively to that manager effect, the active implementation of those asset categories. Fixed income also driving, adding another 20 basis points of relative return over the target. So in total, over the trailing 5-year time period, the portfolio is up 11.23% on an annualized basis, outpacing the target return of 10.96. And again, all of that outperformance being driven by the active implementation of the portfolio. On slides 18 and 19, we show detailed performance for all of the asset categories and individual managers in the portfolio. The top line takeaway from our perspective, no major changes. All managers continue to perform in line with expectations of their strategies. On page 18 here, we look just specifically at the domestic equity portfolio, which was up a modest 37 basis points in the recent quarter, but importantly did very well versus a negative return for the benchmark for the Russell 3000 index. Large cap, of course, is implemented just passively at this point, so with the S&P 500 index. Your small cap managers in particular, I think, are worth comment as they protected value very well in the recent quarter. So despite market volatility and some negative numbers, your small cap managers did very well versus their benchmark. So Prudential small cap value, really a deeper value orientation to that strategy. That strategy had struggled just a couple years ago and has come back nicely, protecting value in the recent quarter up a positive 71 basis points versus a negative return for the Russell 2000 Value Index, down about 3%. Over the trailing year, that strategy is up 83% versus 64% for the benchmark. Similar with the AB US Small Cap Growth Fund, a negative return down about 35 basis points in the quarter, but very nicely protecting value versus a negative 5.5% return for the Russell 2000 Growth Index, also benefiting that trailing 1-year return. Going backwards on the page just a bit in mid-cap, the Fidelity Low Price Stock Fund did underperform just slightly versus its benchmark. It has a smaller capitalization to that strategy than the benchmark. So Greg mentioned that small cap stocks were the worst performers within the domestic equity universe. That was a hindrance to that strategy, but the Janus mid-cap growth strategy fared very well in the quarter, again, protecting value versus a negative return of the benchmark. Mid-cap had been a very tough sort of segment of the domestic equity market for managers in recent quarters, but Janus notably did hold on to their valuation approach to their strategy, and that benefited them in the recent quarter and the recent market environment. So glad to see that. And then on page 19, we look at the remaining asset categories. So international equity at the top, down 3.5% in the recent quarter, was certainly the most challenged asset category in your portfolio and in the broader market as well. So consistency there, but over the trailing year, very strong performance. So 28, almost 29% gain over the trailing year for your international equity composite versus a 24.5% gain for the benchmark. Longer term returns for the international equity composite also have come back nicely. This had been the most challenged asset category in your portfolio, but the trailing 3-year return now ahead of benchmark, which is good to see. Within the composite, Euro Pacific Growth Fund down pretty consistently with the benchmark, but protecting value to the tune of about 50 basis points in the quarter, outperforming over the year. Harbor International is a developed markets only manager within your portfolio, so was the best performing manager within the asset category composite because it doesn't include any emerging markets exposure. Oakmark down about 8.4% in the quarter. This is the most volatile manager within the international equity portfolio. They tend to be the first or the worst. Worst in the recent quarter, but over the trailing year, were the first, up about 41% for the full year. And then Mondrian down about 4%, but similar to Oakmark, a strong performer over the trailing year, up about 26% and well ahead of the benchmark, or 28%. The most challenged pieces of the composite were, again, consistent with the broader markets, was that dedicated emerging markets allocation. So 91 down about 8.5% in the quarter, but pretty consistent with the emerging markets asset category, with that category down about 8.1%. Trailing 1-year performance still intact and strong, almost 20% and ahead of the benchmark. Domestic fixed income, your two managers, Dodge & Cox and PIMCO, continue to outperform the benchmark, both individually and together. So no concerns there. Over the trailing year, the domestic fixed income portfolio is up just over 1%, protecting value versus a negative return for that benchmark, and solid returns overall longer time periods. The JP Morgan infrastructure allocation will update that return as soon as we can. And then real estate, as Greg mentioned, holding very solid within the portfolio, up over 5% in the recent quarter and over 12% for the trailing year. So a good ballast within the portfolio, providing diversification as you would expect from that allocation. And then lastly, just at the bottom, total fund returns again. These are the same returns that we looked at a few slides prior. but down just slightly, about 24 basis points for the quarter, which will change, and up over 24% for the trailing year. Very solid returns over all longer time periods. The last few slides just look at each individual asset class composite versus peers. No concerns from our perspective. Glad to answer any questions at this point, but I think I'll pause there unless there are any concerns or anything I can provide more detail on.
Claire, not seeing any questions. Judy, do we have any comments or questions from members of the public?
No, there are no comments or questions at this time.
Well, I'll just pose the question. So again, my understanding is that CalPERS, they have a policy in place that where they're basically anticipating slightly worse long-term returns when they have sort of excessive positive returns and I think it's above 10% in any 1 year. And my question is, does Callan see any sort of caution on the horizon in terms of returns, maybe based on maybe the belief that the market might be a little overvalued right now?
Well, I would say that from an investment-only perspective, which is different from a long 20-year planning horizon that you deal with, but kind of a shorter-term investment perspective, I think what we've experienced over the last year or two is a pull forward of at least part of the future returns we could earn in the next couple of years. That doesn't mean that we're saying that, hey, you know, the stock market's overvalued and therefore it's going to drop 20%. I'm not saying that, but we should expect a lower stock market return going forward because we had such a strong run up. Valuations are high, which means that, you know, future appreciation will be limited because we already experienced it. You know, we experienced the gains that we would otherwise have over the next few years, at least part of it. Now we on an annual basis come and share with you our long-term expected returns over a 10-year horizon. And at the beginning of this year, we shared with you that our 1-year expected return on average over the next several years is 6.7%. That's a 1-year arithmetic return. And our 10-year geometric return is about 6.0%. So you get to those two numbers converge when you invest in something that's volatile. It's volatility drag. So that 1-year arithmetic return of 6.7 has a volatility of 13, which eats some of that return over time, which means your 10-year compounded geometric return is 6. I don't know if we're going to lower that a lot. We're actually working on those numbers right now. There probably won't be a real meaningful drop, but your 6 3/4 is a little higher than our 6.0. So that's a little bit of your answer there as well, Dan.
Thanks for the insight. I'm glad to hear you're crunching the numbers and looking at the trends all the time. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, we've seen, and I guess we've accepted your report. Any action in particular that we need to take this time?
Not from Callan's perspective. We think you're in good shape.
Okay, right. Well, thank you. I guess that takes. Did we cover the performance report? Did that also cover the quarterly performance report?
Yeah. So that was the quarterly, and we don't have the monthly report yet because this meeting's a little earlier than normal.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Greg and Claire. All right. Well, that takes us to the
Good to
consent.
see you all.
Thank you. Takes us to the
Thanks, all.
consent calendar, which is the minutes of October 20th. Are there any concerns about the minutes? Otherwise, we'll accept those.
I just need to abstain as I was not at the last meeting. I've abstained from the minutes. Part
Okay.
of-
Okay, well then we'll accept the consent calendar. All right, then on to discussion, possible action regarding any, well, we just had discussion regarding administrative report.
Thank you, Chair Judy, members of the board. In the administrator's report, I discussed potential use of a consultant for helping draft the strategic plan. I wanted to get the board's opinion on that. Sarah has used one in the past. I think it might have been all the way back in 2012 though. So it's been a number of years since a consultant assisted with it. I have done strategic planning when I was with Fresno, and I provide an example of the strategic plan that I worked on there for your review, so you can kind of see my work product in that regard. Because it's been a rather unique experience here with the historical benefit review project, and the fact that, of course, we're still all meeting virtually, and I haven't met most of you in person yet. And just the focus of our work currently, I think it could be beneficial to use a consultant to help draft that strategic plan going forward. And I just wanted some input from the board. I did reach out to a couple of companies. Mosaic Governance Advisors solely advises pension plans, so they certainly have a lot of experience in this arena. They are the most expensive of the three firms that I spoke with. Bischoff Performance Improvement Consulting might be familiar to some of you because they are currently working on Mendocino County's strategic plan and helping them with development of their current strategic plan. I also had noticed that Imperial County Retirement System had mentioned a completion of their recent strategic plan in one of their board minutes, and I reached out to Imperial to see who they worked with and how that process was. They used Bridge Group LLC, which happens to be the least expensive of the three firms that I happened to speak with. Full disclosure, though, it turns out I actually know the consultant from Bridge Group LLC because he happened to be city manager during part of my career at the city of Tucson. I don't know him particularly well. When I did speak with him, he didn't actually recall that we happen to be on each other's LinkedIn networks. So I can't say that we have a particularly close relationship, but I did want to let you know that I actually do know the facilitator with Bridge Group. The process is not cheap to involve a consultant, and it would run somewhere between $12,000 and $30,000 depending on the firm. I rounded up to 30 because the 27,500 noted in the cover memo here does not actually include travel costs to have that facilitator come out to an in-person meeting with you should events transition that we can return to in-person board meetings. There would be questions about whether or not we would need to do an RFP, and I just wanted to get some feedback from the board regarding this idea, and also which meeting in early next year, the first quarter, is the board interested in trying to schedule the strategic plan meeting.
Any thoughts, comments, feedback? Vice Chair Smith?
I would support an outside consultant. I know it is a lot of money, and I think there's a big difference between the 12,000 and the 30,000. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity there to look at different scenarios or different consultants, I guess. I would think that an RFP would be in order. And the reason I would support an outside consultant is just that, Doris, you and staff and everybody just has so much on your plate with this benefit project that I would think that the board would not want to burden you with that task at this time.
Thank you. Director Forster?
I would agree with Trustee Smith's comments, and looking at these consultants, I would prefer to utilize one that has experience with Retirement Act systems. So the First Mosaic or Bridge Group would be the two I was interested in. And as far as the dates, I would prefer a February or March if it matters to anyone else.
Thank you. Director Anderson.
Yeah, I would just like to echo my support of the former trustees and um, and again for the use of an RFP. I think when it comes to strategic planning, you can get some pretty broad approaches to strategic planning, and being able to make a well-informed decision through the description of the process in an RFP, I think would be an excellent idea.
I actually have written proposals from the 3 firms that I reached out to. I'm happy to share those with the board or an ad hoc committee, however this works. If you would like us to issue a actual RFP and open it for competitive bids, which is not in problem, but it might address the timing of when we can have that meeting, because we would need time to open it for proposals and then evaluate those proposals and make a selection and move forward. So there could be a little bit of push in the timeline as far as when we would have the meeting to move forward with the strategic plan if we issue a full RFP.
If I may, just through the chair, I think Doris, if you feel like you have sufficient information for us to differentiate the offerings of the 3, it may be that the proposals that you have right now are sufficient.
Jeff, are there considerations that we need to look at here as far as whether or not I can just share those 3 proposals with all of the members of the board?
I was shaking my head. I thinking you were going to ask me a different question. I'm not sure what you're asking me now. You mean to avoid this coming back? I mean, it's not. I'm not sure what you mean, but it's not agendized today for action. So if you're looking to make a final decision, you're going to have to come back on that.
It's here for direction, but if the direction was that they'd want to consider the firms listed here, would I be able to share the proposals with the board outside of it being on a regularly agendized meeting, or would it have to wait till December, or I don't know what the process there would be?
You're going to have to come back you're going to have to come back for them to approve a contract. And
Correct.
I think you're creating an issue if you have all these side conversations. Is that what you're saying? And draw a consensus?
Would the board need to create maybe a committee to review the proposals?
Sure. Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Okay, who would like to volunteer on an ad hoc to meet with Doris to select a preferred advisor?
I hear crickets.
Depending upon the time, I'd be happy to do the job. I'm just not sure what time I might have in the next month, but if the schedule works out, I will.
And Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to as well.
I think 2 board members is plenty of input, probably. So, so that'd be great. All right. Do we have any public comment in this agenda item?
There is no public comment on this item.
We've got your administrative and operations report. Do we have, that concludes that item? Do you have anything else? Okay. General board member items, anything else? All right. Well, our next board meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, December 15th. And with that, I think we're adjourned at 11:24.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody.